They say the moment you step between a child and danger, you stop being just a teacher and become something you were never prepared to be. My name is Olivia Harper, and I learned that lesson on an ordinary Tuesday morning inside a classroom that was anything but ordinary in what it hid. The school was old, underfunded, and always too loud in the wrong ways, with peeling paint on the walls and desks that had seen more frustration than learning. But even in that chaos, there was one constant silence that always caught my attention. It came from the back row, where a boy named Ethan Moretti sat alone every single day, his eyes lowered, his voice never joining the laughter of other children. No one spoke to him unless required, and no one stayed near him longer than necessary, as if something invisible surrounded him. I never understood why until that day. It started during a group activity. The room was filled with noise, pencils scraping paper, students arguing over answers, and the usual restlessness that came with trying to teach children who did not want to be taught. Then I heard it. A sharp laugh followed by a cruel comment directed at Ethan. One of the older boys had knocked his notebook off the desk. Papers scattered across the floor, and instead of helping him, the others laughed louder. Ethan did not fight back. He simply bent down slowly, picking up his things with hands that trembled slightly, as if he had done this many times before. Something inside me shifted at that moment. I walked across the room without raising my voice, but the entire class went quiet as I knelt beside him and helped gather the papers. I told the students firmly that this classroom would not tolerate cruelty, not even in silence. The room fell into an uneasy stillness after that, but what struck me most was not the reaction of the class. It was the way Ethan looked at me afterward. Not grateful, not relieved, just surprised, as if no one had ever stepped in for him before. After class, I asked him gently if he wanted to stay a little longer. He hesitated, then shook his head and left quickly, almost as if staying would create a problem he had learned to avoid. I watched him go, not realizing that this small moment would lead me into something far larger than a school disciplinary issue. Later that afternoon, while reviewing student records in the empty classroom, I noticed something unusual in his file. His emergency contact information was minimal, almost deliberately incomplete, and the only surname listed was Moretti. I paused when I saw it, but at the time, I did not connect it to anything meaningful. Not until later that same day, when the atmosphere outside the school changed in a way that could not be ignored. The sound of engines rolled through the street, deeper and more controlled than ordinary traffic. Students leaving the building slowed down, then stopped entirely. Teachers near the windows fell silent. I looked up and saw a black car parked directly outside the school gates, unmoving, as if it did not belong to the flow of normal life. No one spoke. Even the air felt different. And then I saw him step out. A man in a dark tailored coat, calm in a way that made everything around him feel louder. He did not rush. He did not look around nervously. He simply walked forward as if the entire street had already been waiting for him. And in that moment, I had no idea that the boy I had defended just hours earlier was about to bring the most feared name in the city directly into my classroom life, changing everything I thought I understood about safety, authority, and consequence. The moment the black car stopped in front of the school gates, it felt like the entire street had paused to observe something no one fully understood, but everyone instinctively feared. I remember standing near the classroom window, my hand still holding a stack of graded papers, when I saw the students outside slow their movements, their voices fading one by one as if sound itself had been drained from the air. Teachers near the corridor stopped walking. Even the usual chaos of dismissal time seemed to dissolve into an uneasy silence. And then I saw him again, the same man from earlier, stepping out of the vehicle with a controlled calm that did not match the tension around him. He wore a dark coat that seemed too simple for the weight his presence carried, and he did not look around like someone searching. He looked forward like someone who already knew exactly where he needed to be. I did not understand why, but my instincts told me this was connected to the boy I had protected earlier. Ethan Moretti. The name suddenly felt heavier in my mind than it had when I first read it in the file. I moved away from the window and stepped into the hallway, just as whispers began spreading through the school like cracks forming in glass. Someone said his name under their breath. Someone else warned a student to stay inside. The atmosphere shifted in a way I had never experienced in a place meant for children. By the time I reached the entrance, the man was already inside the building. He did not rush, did not speak loudly, did not demand attention. And yet every person who passed him moved aside without question, as if instinct alone was enough to recognize authority. When his eyes finally landed on me, I felt something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind of awareness that comes when you realize a decision you made earlier has consequences you did not yet understand. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see his expression clearly. It was not anger. It was not hostility. It was something far more controlled than either of those emotions. He asked one simple question. Where was his son? I hesitated for only a second before telling him Ethan was in class. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded once, then began walking past me toward the classroom hallway. I followed without fully deciding to, because something inside me refused to let this moment happen without understanding it. As we walked, I noticed the way people reacted to him, not with panic, but with restraint, as if his presence alone required discipline from everyone around him. When we reached the classroom door, I saw Ethan still sitting at his desk, unaware of what was happening outside. The contrast between the quiet boy inside and the storm forming just beyond the door made my chest tighten. I stepped slightly ahead of him and told the man calmly that I had been the one who intervened earlier when Ethan was being mistreated. I expected anger, questions, maybe even confrontation. Instead, he simply looked at me for a long moment, as if evaluating something beyond the surface of my words. Then he said something I did not expect. He said he had been informed about what happened, not by the school, not by rumor, but through channels that I did not need to understand. His tone remained steady, but there was a weight in his words that made it clear he was not here to argue. He was here to assess. I told him I only acted because it was the right thing to do. For a brief moment, something almost unnoticeable shifted in his expression. Not approval, not disagreement, but recognition. The kind that suggests a line has been drawn between ordinary events and something far more complicated. Then he turned his gaze toward the classroom again, watching his son through the glass window. Ethan had finally noticed him and froze immediately, unsure whether to stand or stay seated. And in that silence between father and child, I realized I had unknowingly stepped into a situation where morality, power, and consequence were all beginning to collide in ways I was not prepared to face. For a long moment after he appeared at the classroom door, nothing in the hallway moved. It felt as if even the building itself was holding its breath. I stood slightly in front of him without fully realizing I had done it, as if my body had decided before my mind that I would not allow this moment to turn into something the students could misinterpret or fear. Inside the classroom, Ethan remained frozen in his seat, his small hands gripping the edges of his desk. He was looking directly at his father now, and I could see the conflict in his expression even from a distance. Not fear exactly, but hesitation, as if he was unsure whether he was allowed to react freely. The man in the dark coat did not move closer. He simply observed his son through the glass, his expression controlled in a way that made it impossible to guess what he was thinking. Then he spoke again, this time more quietly, asking me to confirm what had happened earlier. I told him exactly what I had seen. I did not exaggerate, and I did not minimize it. I explained how the other students had isolated Ethan, how the situation had escalated, and how I had intervened to stop it. As I spoke, I noticed something subtle in his posture. He was not reacting like someone being informed of an incident involving his child. He was reacting like someone confirming a pattern he already knew existed. When I finished, there was a brief silence before he asked a question I did not expect. He asked if this kind of behavior was common in my classroom. The question was not aggressive, but it carried weight. I told him honestly that children can be unkind, but that I did not allow cruelty when I saw it. He nodded once, slowly, as if that answer mattered more than I realized. Then he turned his attention fully toward the classroom again. Ethan had finally stood up, though hesitantly, and was now walking toward the door. I instinctively stepped aside as the boy opened it, unsure what would happen next. When Ethan saw his father at close distance, he stopped immediately. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt deeper than anything else in the hallway. Then the father lowered his gaze slightly, softening just enough that the intensity in the air shifted. He asked Ethan if he was hurt. The question was simple, but it carried a kind of restraint I had not expected from someone I had been taught to associate with fear. Ethan shook his head slightly, still unsure how to respond. I could see he was not used to direct emotional attention from his father, especially not in a public place. The man looked at him for another moment before placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was not forceful. It was careful, almost hesitant, like someone trying to reconnect with something they were afraid of handling incorrectly. He told Ethan that he would be waiting outside when school ended. Then he looked at me again, briefly, and gave a small nod that I could not easily interpret. It was not gratitude, and it was not warning. It was something in between, something that acknowledged my involvement without defining it. After he left the hallway, the atmosphere slowly shifted again, but not back to normal. Students began to whisper, teachers began to move, and life inside the school resumed its rhythm. Yet nothing felt the same as before. I returned to my classroom, but I could not focus on the lesson I had planned. My thoughts kept returning to the interaction I had just witnessed. A child who lived in silence, and a father whose presence made silence feel intentional rather than empty. I did not yet understand what kind of world I had stepped into, but I understood one thing clearly. The moment I chose to defend Ethan, I had not only intervened in a school conflict. I had crossed into the edge of something far larger, where personal decisions carried consequences that reached beyond the classroom walls and into a life I had never been meant to see up close. After Ethan left the classroom with his father, the entire school felt different, as if something invisible had shifted in the structure of everyday life. I tried to continue teaching, but my focus kept breaking in ways I could not control. Students were quieter than usual, not because they understood what had happened, but because they sensed something unusual in the atmosphere. Even the usual background noise of the school felt restrained, like the building itself was waiting for something to resolve. When the final bell rang, I stayed behind longer than normal, organizing papers I did not need to organize, simply because I was not ready to leave. The image of the man in the dark coat kept returning to my thoughts, not just his presence, but the way everything around him seemed to adjust without resistance. There was something about his control that did not rely on force, but on certainty. That was what unsettled me the most. Later that afternoon, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed a black vehicle again outside the school. It was not parked in a way that suggested urgency, but rather patience. As I stepped outside, I saw him standing near it, waiting as if he had already assumed I would eventually appear. I hesitated for a moment before approaching. He did not initiate conversation immediately. Instead, he observed the school building behind me, then shifted his attention to me as if confirming something internally. I asked him why he was still here. He replied that he was ensuring that what happened today did not create unnecessary consequences for either the school or the children involved. His tone remained calm, but there was a layer of responsibility in his words that I did not fully understand. I told him that I did not want Ethan to feel afraid because of what had happened. He nodded slightly, acknowledging my concern without dismissing it. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said fear was not always created by action, but sometimes by absence. I did not respond right away because I was trying to understand what he meant. He continued by saying that Ethan had spent a long time experiencing absence in different forms, and that what he needed now was consistency, not correction. The way he spoke about his son was different from how I had expected. There was no dominance in his words, only a structured kind of awareness, as if he had spent a long time thinking about how to exist in his child's life without overwhelming it. I asked him if he planned to keep appearing at the school. He answered that he would only appear when necessary, but that necessity was no longer defined only by crisis. That statement made me uneasy, because it suggested that the boundaries I assumed existed were not the same boundaries he operated within. Before I could ask more, a staff member from the school approached briefly to confirm that everything was fine. The man gave a short nod, and the staff member left without further question. It was then I realized how easily his presence altered the behavior of others without a single raised voice. As he prepared to leave, he turned slightly and told me that Ethan would return to class tomorrow as usual. Then he paused for a moment before adding that my intervention had not gone unnoticed. I was not sure if that was meant as acknowledgement or warning. When he got into the car and drove away, I remained standing outside the school longer than I intended, trying to process what had just happened. I had entered this situation believing I was simply protecting a child in my classroom. But now it felt like I had stepped into a layered world where every action had consequences I could not yet see, and where the line between teacher, protector, and participant in something far larger was beginning to blur in ways I had never prepared for. The next morning arrived with a strange sense of continuity, as if nothing had changed on the surface of the world, yet everything beneath it had quietly shifted. I walked into the classroom earlier than usual, needing the familiarity of routine to stabilize my thoughts after everything that had happened. The desks were empty, the lights slightly too bright, and the silence felt heavier than normal, as if the room itself remembered yesterday. Ethan arrived a few minutes later, walking in with the same quiet presence he always had, but something about him felt different. He was no longer avoiding eye contact in the same way. He still remained reserved, but there was a subtle awareness in his posture, as if he understood that something around him had changed, even if he could not fully explain it. When I greeted him, he responded softly, and for the first time, I noticed a brief hesitation before he sat down instead of immediate retreat. The lesson began like any other day, but I found myself observing him more than the rest of the class without intending to. There was still distance between him and the other students, but it was no longer as sharp as before. A few children even spoke to him briefly during group work, though cautiously, as if unsure whether yesterday's events still carried invisible consequences. Midway through the morning, I noticed movement outside the classroom window. A black vehicle was parked across the street again, in the same controlled manner as before. My attention shifted for a moment, but I did not leave the classroom. I already knew who it was. Ethan noticed it too. I saw him glance toward the window briefly before returning to his work without comment. That small reaction told me more than anything else had so far. He was aware of his father's presence even from a distance, and yet he was no longer reacting with visible tension. After class, I asked him gently if he was doing all right. He nodded, but did not elaborate. There was something about children like him that made silence feel like a learned language rather than absence. Later that day, as I was gathering materials, I received a brief message from the school administration stating that Ethan's attendance and academic support would now be monitored more closely due to external involvement. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear. The situation had moved beyond a simple classroom matter. When I stepped outside after school hours, I found the man in the dark coat waiting again, though this time he was not standing near the entrance. He was positioned slightly farther away, as if deliberately maintaining distance. I approached cautiously, unsure what to expect. He asked if Ethan had adjusted back into the classroom without issue. I told him that there had been no problems, only quiet observation from both the child and the environment around him. He nodded, as if that outcome aligned with something he had already anticipated. I then asked him directly why he continued to monitor the situation so closely. He looked toward the school for a moment before answering. He said that environments shape children more than instructions ever do, and that not all environments are visible in obvious ways. I asked if he believed the school was unsafe. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he said that safety was not always about danger, but about consistency of influence. That statement stayed with me longer than I expected. Before leaving, he told me that I would likely notice small changes over time, not because anything dramatic would happen, but because systems around Ethan were being adjusted to prevent the conditions that had led to isolation in the first place. I asked him if he was responsible for those adjustments. He did not confirm it directly, but the silence that followed felt like an answer in itself. As he drove away, I remained standing outside the school again, realizing that my role in Ethan's life was no longer limited to what happened inside the classroom. I was now connected to a situation that extended far beyond education, into structures I did not fully understand, guided by a man who never raised his voice, yet seemed to influence everything he touched without needing to explain why. The following days did not bring dramatic changes, yet everything around me continued to shift in quiet and irreversible ways. The classroom returned to its usual rhythm, with lessons, assignments, and the constant background noise of students trying to find their place in a system that rarely slowed down for any individual. But I noticed that Ethan was no longer treated the same way he had been before. It was subtle at first. A classmate who once ignored him now passed him a pencil without hesitation. Another student asked him to join a group discussion without the usual awkward silence that had followed him for weeks. These were small changes, but in a place like this, small changes rarely happen by accident. Outside the school, I continued to notice the black vehicle from time to time, always positioned at a distance that suggested observation rather than intrusion. It never blocked entrances or interrupted routines. It simply existed in the background, as if its purpose was not to interfere, but to ensure that nothing reverted back to what it had been before. One afternoon after class, I found Ethan waiting for me instead of leaving immediately with the other students. He stood near my desk, holding his bag with both hands, hesitating in a way I had not seen before. When I asked if something was wrong, he shook his head slightly and said he just wanted to say thank you. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than he seemed to realize. I told him he did not need to thank me for treating him fairly, but he looked down and said that fairness was not something he had experienced consistently enough to consider it normal. That statement stayed with me long after he left the room. Later that same day, I was called briefly to the administration office. The principal explained that Ethan's situation had been reviewed externally and that additional resources would be made available for his education and well-being. The explanation was careful and deliberately vague, but I understood what it meant. Someone had intervened beyond the school's usual boundaries. When I left the office, I found myself thinking less about policy and more about the man in the dark coat. He had never directly claimed responsibility for these changes, but everything pointed in the same direction. That evening, as I was leaving the school building, I saw him again. He was standing near the edge of the parking area, not approaching, not waiting in any obvious sense, but simply present. I walked toward him without fully deciding to, as if my body had already accepted that this conversation was inevitable. I asked him if he was the one influencing what was happening inside the school. He did not deny it. Instead, he said that influence was not always about control, but about removing conditions that allowed harm to repeat itself unnoticed. I told him that schools were not usually part of the world he seemed to operate in. He replied that environments affecting children were always part of his attention, regardless of labels or systems. I asked him directly what he expected from me in all of this. His answer was quiet but clear. He said he expected nothing beyond what I had already chosen to do on my own. I had defended Ethan without being asked. Everything after that, he explained, was simply an attempt to ensure that one act of protection did not get undone by neglect or indifference. There was a long silence between us after that. I realized that my original assumption, that I had simply stepped into a single incident, was no longer accurate. I had entered into a chain of consequences that extended beyond my classroom, beyond my authority, and into a world where decisions were shaped by forces I was only beginning to recognize. As I stood there, watching him turn slightly toward the car that waited nearby, I understood something that unsettled me more than fear. I was no longer only observing Ethan's world from the outside. I had become part of the space where that world was being quietly reshaped, and stepping away from it no longer felt like something I could do without consequence or clarity about what would remain if I did. After that conversation outside the school, something inside me began to change in a way I could not easily describe. It was not sudden, and it was not dramatic, but it was persistent, like a quiet awareness that followed me from one hour to the next. The school continued its normal rhythm, but I no longer experienced it in the same way. I noticed more details now. The way students interacted with Ethan had softened further, not through instruction, but through something closer to behavioral adjustment. No one openly referenced what had happened, yet the atmosphere around him had clearly shifted. He was still quiet, still reserved, but no longer isolated in the same absolute way. One morning, as I arrived early to prepare my lesson, I found a small envelope placed discreetly on my desk. There was no name written on the outside. Inside was a simple note stating that additional support staff had been assigned to assist certain students who required it, including Ethan. There was no signature, but I did not need one. Later that day, I noticed two unfamiliar adults in the school environment observing from a distance, speaking briefly with administration, and then leaving without drawing attention. Everything was done in a way that avoided disruption, yet it was clear that something structured was being built around Ethan's environment. During class, I tried to focus on teaching, but my attention kept drifting toward the realization that I was no longer dealing with a single student case. I was witnessing a system quietly reorganizing itself around one child without public explanation. After school, Ethan stayed behind again. This time he did not approach my desk immediately. He stood near the doorway, watching me finish organizing materials, as if waiting for permission that I had not explicitly denied. When I finally acknowledged him, he walked closer and asked if things were going to keep changing. His question was not fearful, but observant, as if he had already started noticing patterns that even adults often overlooked. I told him that change did not always mean something negative. He nodded slowly, but did not fully seem convinced. As he left, I noticed the same black vehicle outside again, but positioned farther away than before. It was no longer drawing attention, yet its presence remained consistent. That evening, I found myself thinking less about what had already happened and more about what it meant for the future. The man in the dark coat had not forced any direct decisions upon me, yet every development seemed to align with a larger structure that I was only partially able to see. I began to understand that his influence did not operate through confrontation or visible authority. It functioned through repositioning circumstances until outcomes naturally shifted without resistance. A few days later, I was called unexpectedly to a brief meeting with school administration and an external consultant. The conversation was professional, structured, and carefully worded. They explained that Ethan's academic environment would be supported by external resources aimed at stability and long-term development. When I asked who authorized the involvement, the answer was vague and indirect. No single name was provided, yet the implication was clear enough for me to recognize. After the meeting, I stood alone in the hallway for a long time, realizing that I had crossed from being a teacher reacting to a single incident into someone standing inside a larger framework of decisions I did not initiate. That evening, as I left the school building, I saw him again. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he waited until I noticed him. When I finally walked closer, I asked him what all of this was leading to. He looked at me for a moment before answering that it was not about direction, but about correction of conditions that should not have been allowed to persist. I told him that I was still trying to understand where my role ended in all of this. He replied that it had not ended anywhere yet, because nothing around Ethan had stabilized enough to consider it finished. As he turned to leave, I remained standing there longer than I intended, realizing that whatever boundary I had once believed separated my life from his world was no longer clearly defined. I had not chosen to enter it, but I was no longer outside of it either, and that realization carried a weight I was only beginning to learn how to carry. The following days felt different in a way that could not be measured by routine or schedule, but only by atmosphere. The school still functioned as it always had, with morning arrivals, structured lessons, and the familiar rhythm of children moving between subjects. Yet there was an invisible layer of order now present that had not existed before. Ethan no longer sat completely alone. He was still quiet, still reserved, but the distance between him and the rest of the class had softened into something less absolute. It was not friendship in any clear sense, but it was no longer isolation either. I noticed small things that suggested adjustment rather than coincidence. Group assignments were arranged more evenly. Conflicts between students were resolved faster, often before I even needed to intervene. Even administrative behavior toward Ethan had become unusually attentive, though never openly explained. One afternoon, I received a formal notice stating that additional educational support services had been integrated into his learning plan. The language was neutral, but I recognized the pattern behind it. This was not a routine improvement. It was a coordinated shift in environment. After class that same day, Ethan remained behind longer than usual. He did not approach immediately, but instead watched as I organized the classroom, as if trying to determine whether what he wanted to ask was appropriate. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He asked if things were supposed to feel different now, or if he was simply imagining it. I told him that sometimes change feels unfamiliar before it feels normal. He considered that for a moment and then nodded, though I could see he was still processing more than he was expressing. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and said that people were looking at him differently now. Not unkindly, but differently enough that he noticed. I did not know how to fully answer that, so I simply told him that being seen was not always a bad thing, even if it felt uncomfortable at first. Later that evening, I saw the familiar black vehicle again, though it remained farther away than before, positioned in a way that suggested observation rather than engagement. I no longer reacted to its presence with surprise. It had become part of the background structure of my days, like a silent indicator that decisions were still being made beyond my visibility. As I walked home, I found myself thinking about the man behind it all. He had never attempted to control my actions directly, yet everything around Ethan had gradually shifted in alignment with outcomes that would have been impossible within the normal limits of a public school system. It was subtle, but undeniable. The boundaries of what I thought I understood about influence and authority were no longer stable. The next morning, I was called briefly into the administration office again. The conversation was calm, almost routine in tone, but the content confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Ethan's environment was now under a broader framework of external coordination designed to ensure stability and long-term support. When I asked, once again, who was responsible for initiating such extensive involvement, the answer remained carefully undefined. After leaving the office, I stood alone in the hallway for several minutes, realizing that the absence of a name was beginning to feel more deliberate than any explanation could have been. That afternoon, as I prepared to leave the school, I found him waiting in the same quiet position near the edge of the parking area. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he waited until I approached. When I asked him directly what the end goal of all these changes was, he looked toward the school building for a moment before answering that there was no single endpoint, only a gradual correction of conditions that should never have been allowed to persist in the first place. I told him that I was beginning to understand that my involvement had consequences I had not anticipated. He replied that consequences were only visible when change began to take hold, not when it was initiated. As he prepared to leave, he added something that stayed with me longer than anything else he had said so far. He said that Ethan would not need protection forever, only until the environment around him no longer required it. Then he left without waiting for a response. I remained standing there long after the car disappeared, fully aware now that I was no longer simply witnessing change. I was inside it, and whatever direction it ultimately took would continue to include me whether I intended it or not. The last day of that week arrived with a strange stillness that felt less like an ending and more like the quiet before something fully settles into place. I noticed it the moment I entered the classroom. The atmosphere had changed again, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested completion rather than transition. Ethan was already seated, as usual, but this time there was something different in the way he carried himself. The distance that had once defined him was still there, yet it no longer felt like isolation. It felt like structure. Other students moved around him without hesitation now, as if some unspoken understanding had been established over time without any formal announcement. The changes that had been building over the past days and weeks had reached a point where they no longer felt temporary. They felt integrated into the environment itself. I began the lesson as usual, but my attention kept returning to Ethan, not out of concern, but out of observation. He was no longer reacting to the world around him in fragments. He was participating in it, quietly and steadily, as if something inside his daily experience had been recalibrated. After class, he approached me without hesitation for the first time. He asked if I thought things would stay like this. His question was simple, but it carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough in uncertainty to recognize stability as something unfamiliar. I told him that sometimes stability is not a moment, but a pattern that continues if nothing interrupts it. He nodded, and for the first time, there was no visible tension in his response. When he left the classroom, I remained behind for a few moments longer than usual, trying to understand what had changed most clearly. It was not just Ethan. It was everything surrounding him. The school no longer treated him as an anomaly. Staff interactions were consistent. Administrative processes were aligned. Even the subtle attentiveness that had once felt unusual now appeared normalized, as if the system had adjusted itself to accommodate a reality that had already been decided elsewhere. Later that afternoon, I saw the black vehicle one final time. It was parked farther away than before, positioned at the edge of visibility rather than at the center of attention. I did not approach it. I did not need to. Its presence no longer carried the same sense of disruption. Instead, it felt like confirmation. As I gathered my belongings to leave, I reflected on everything that had happened since the day I first stepped in to defend Ethan. What began as a simple moral decision inside a classroom had expanded into something far larger, involving influence I had never directly seen but could no longer deny. I had once believed I was acting within the boundaries of education, but those boundaries had gradually dissolved without warning. That evening, I met him one last time near the edge of the school grounds. He did not speak immediately, and neither did I. There was no need for urgency anymore. The changes had already taken shape. When I finally asked him what happens now, he answered with the same calm clarity he always carried. He said that nothing dramatic needed to happen from this point forward, because the conditions that created instability had already been addressed. I told him that I still did not fully understand the extent of what had been done. He replied that understanding was not always required for resolution, only participation at the right moment. Then he looked toward the school for a final time and said that Ethan would continue forward without interruption, and that my role had already been fulfilled without me realizing when it began to settle into place. After that, he turned and left without another word. I stood there for a long time afterward, realizing that the story I thought I had entered by accident had already completed its most important shift long before I was aware of it. What remained was not uncertainty, but recognition that some interventions do not announce themselves as turning points while they are happening. They only reveal their impact once everything around them has already changed.